The content of this podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be considered medical advice. Always consult with a qualified healthcare professional for any health concerns. Take care of yourself out there.
Welcome to Unravelling. This is a podcast that sees the world through the lens of mental health. I'm Mary Wilson, a journalist.
And I'm Kurt White, a social worker and psychotherapist.
So we're really excited about our guest today, Professor Nnamdi Pole, who I know, Kurt, you've known for a long time, both working together at Smith and the School for Social Work.
Yes, absolutely. We have a number of points of intersection, and he has a very distinguished bio, I should say. He's very accomplished in his field. He's the Harold Edward Israel and Elsa Cipolla Israel Professor of Psychology at Smith College. He is the chair of the psychology department and the chair of the Institutional Review Board. He's worked with many national organizations like the American Psychological Association's Division 56, which is the trauma division, as a council representative, and has been a part of the APA's PTSD Guideline Update Panel. He's an associate editor at Psychology Bulletin, a really interesting journal that looks at meta-analyses. And through all of that has always been a teacher of undergraduates, as well as in the Smith School for Social Work program, graduate students, including master's and doctoral graduate students. So really quite an extensive biography.
And Professor Pole teaches a really fascinating and important class called The Psychology of the Black Experience. So how did you come to learn about that class?
You know, I think it just must have come up in one of our conversations at some point. But I was immediately fascinated by it. I think, honestly, the title pulled me in, as it suggests something that is missing in the field, you know, and I related to it immediately as something that is probably missing in me also. I think through much of my training, we have studied things like anti-racism perspectives and perspectives on diversity and culture, but I hadn't really had that phrase in my head, you know, the psychology of Black experience. How is that? How does that work exactly? You know, and what does even psychology mean in that sense, right? It's psychology can be a discipline, like Professor Pole is a psychologist, or it can refer to an individual's psychology. But here it's also referring to the idea of a group psychology, or collective psychology, a way that a group of people might think about themselves, maybe even consciously and unconsciously. How are they organized? How do we think? What do we value? Where do problems show up for us, and how do we deal with them? And why is it that way? And is it different than people in a different group, for example, the sort of dominant group, a white psychology, or a sort of a gendered version of things? You could look at it through different lenses like that. And I felt myself kind of move into a learner position, and I really wanted to know more about that.
Feels so right to have this conversation during Black History Month, because learning about psychology, understanding it, it's not just the individual perspectives, but how society and culture as a whole come to affect us and how we feel.
Yeah, that's right. And I think, I was really lucky because when the COVID pandemic hit, tragically, Professor Pole pivoted to teaching online. And although Smith College from Brattleboro was about a 45-minute drive, online is a 0-minute drive. So I asked him, could I audit the course? Could I be an undergraduate again and sit in the background and do the readings and see what this course is all about? And he graciously said yes. And I have such learnings from that have endured. And meanwhile, I think, like many other people, have become interested in this course and what it means to be teaching a course like this in the world that we live in now, which seems to be changing rapidly and going through many crises and sometimes very painfully so. So we decided to talk to him about the class itself and how did he come to think about this? How did he get into it? What has he learned from it? And what has he sought to teach, and to whom? And how has he done it? And there are some really interesting and subtle links and relationships to the whole way that we think about ideas of ourselves in the world, about the sort of function of larger social problems like racism and the function of racism at the level of individual and group psychology, and how we even conceptualize those things, especially in groups that are not in the sort of dominant group in society, for example.
Yeah, we traveled to Amherst, Massachusetts for this conversation, and we hope you enjoy it. Take a listen.
So, Professor Pole, welcome to Unravelling.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah. So I want to talk with you today about this course that you've been teaching for, I think, over 15 years. Is that right?
That's right.
The Psychology of the Black Experience, it's called.
That's correct. Yeah.
How did you come to be teaching this course?
Yeah. So normally when I teach a class, I name the class, and I'm kind of the originator of the class. Mm-hmm. But this was an unusual case. When I work at Smith College, and I answered an ad for a professor who could do several things, but one of the things they mentioned in the ad is they're looking for someone to teach a course called Psychology of the Black Experience. I will say, when I saw the title of the course, I was a little skeptical of it. It isn't what I would have named the class. I had a sort of a personal reaction to it. I had been teaching classes. The classes I taught in this area were entitled things like culture, ethnicity, and mental health. They were broader, and they tried to speak to psychological processes that affect diverse populations. But at the time when I saw that title, I thought, this is really narrowing in on the so-called quote-unquote Black experience. And I was skeptical about whether there is a Black experience. I didn't sort of like that phrasing. I would say personally I didn't like it because I think of myself as, in some ways, a sort of a counter stereotype. And I wondered, is there just one Black experience? Having said that, I applied for the job and got the job, and then saw it as my job to captain the course with this title. And it's a course that had been in existence before I came. It was a popular course. It was a course that students had some expectations for. So I didn't think it was my role to just change it. I thought it was my role to understand what was valuable about it and to make it my own.
What were you thinking of as the goals for the class, and who was your audience?
Sure. So as I said, I'm a faculty member at Smith College in Northampton, Massachusetts, and Smith is a school that's well known, but to anyone listening who doesn't know, it's one of the oldest women's institutions in the country. Students who go to Smith historically have had a lot of economic privilege. It has been a predominantly white institution, but over time has sought to diversify on a number of fronts, including more first-generation college students, more international students, and more students from the United States of color. But still, when I arrived in 2008 to teach the class for the first time in January 2009, it was a predominantly white school with a handful of Black students. So I would say I understood, and I understood this, by the way, having had my own graduate school experience at UC Berkeley, where I was I was the first African-American male in that program in 10 years. I was basically in a predominantly white setting where I was, eager to have classes that spoke to diverse experiences. So I sort of understood if I'm coming into Smith, first and foremost, this is a course that's meant to address the appetite of the minority students, particularly the Black students, for a course that speaks to their experience, essentially. Actually, when I first got there, the first fall semester, knowing I was going to teach it in January of 2009, I interviewed a bunch of students, primarily the Black students first, to understand what they were looking for from the course. And students shared with me certain anecdotes of what we would call microaggressions that had happened on campus. I remember one particular anecdote about a Halloween party that had just happened, where white students had gone to the Halloween party dressed as famous Black celebrities. At the time, there was a very popular TV show with Whitney Houston and Bobby Brown, and some students from a nearby college white students had shown up basically in blackface, dressed up as Whitney Houston and Bobby Brown. And these Black students were quite outraged by this. It led to a lot of campus turmoil. And the white students who did this, claimed that they were just, showing their love of these celebrities, and they were not intending to offend anybody. And again, I don't know the white students involved, but to me, this episode was one that I'd heard before, has happened on other campuses, and I saw this as one of the needs for this class. First and foremost, it was a place to center, and it was sort of a home base for Black students who looked at the curriculum at Smith and also within the psychology department and didn't see a lot of content and even a lot of historical figures that sort of looked like them. And that seemed to be important. And I think it is important, especially if you think about just think about the age. Again, wearing my head as a psychologist. These are people who usually are in their, late teens, early 20s. They are emerging adults. They're still working through identity. That's a very big thing. We easily understand that the act of choosing a major is a major sort of identity search. Students are also exploring sexuality on campus, figuring out where they are, in terms of their sexual orientations and things, and kind of how they want to relate to people. And along the lines, they're growing in terms of their own ethnic and racial identities as well. So it's not a surprise that Black students, especially if they're coming from predominantly Black neighborhoods into this white space, are suddenly trying to figure out new questions about their Blackness, essentially. And white students who may come from predominantly white spaces and suddenly seeing all this diversity have some growth to do about their own experience. So for me, this class is in part sensitive to that. So it's primarily a home base for Black students, but also a place where non-Black students who are interested can learn about the experience of others. And I guess one thing I want to say before letting you get a word in edgewise is that a crucial part of the success of this course is that it is not mandatory. It is a class that everybody who's there wants to be there.
It strikes me that it must be hard to teach a course with those two objectives and different audiences in the same room at the same moment. How do you navigate that?
Yeah, that continues to be a little bit of a challenge. And one of the things I do is I sort of declare early on in the class that this is a class predominantly for the Black students. And what I mean by that is that this is the only class like this in the curriculum, right? And also the class is cross-listed with Africana studies. So we've got some students there who are not psychology students who I also want to make sure I serve them well. We use this language of again, centering the Black experience. So the idea is that when a student takes a conventional psychology class, they're seeing a field that is sort of presented from a Western perspective. So, you could call it a white perspective, but that Western European kind of perspective is the default. Every other course has that. So I think my white students are quite okay with the idea that in this one class, we're not going to do that. We're going to center the experience so if it feels to you like it's not 50-50 or it feels like it's really skewed to the Black students, that's by intention. At the same time, the class is also very sensitive to the challenge of being a white student in a class like that. Let's just give one example. I think it's typically the case that the Black students in my class have spent quite a lot of time thinking about race and racism, and the white students may have spent a lot less time or thought about it in a lot less depth, or have never been had it discussed with them by their parents, all of that. So for me, and this is what I ask for my Black students. So the white students are asked to be comfortable with the idea this class isn't primarily for you. The Black students are asked to sort of say, hey, be patient. Like, this is a place where we agree that everybody in the room has work to do, essentially. And part of the work of the Black students is to be patient with the white students' kind of novelty and their kind of, their newness to this and the possibility they might make awkward mistakes. All of that is okay in the classroom, and I set conditions where that is safe to happen. Everybody's learning it. And I think why it works, again, is that the Black students do really appreciate that their experience is centered and that they are the priority. And they see the white students who are there because they want to be there. And so there's a kind of, openness to letting that process unfold. So I would say that's partly how I navigate it. That's sort of the implicit exchange that happens in the room.
Mm-hmm. I mean, one thing I really like about the title of the course is that it does right from the first moment. It gives you sort of that suggestion that it could be true that maybe many of the psychology courses we've taken before now, for example, the students have taken before now, we're really centering the white experience. Actually, right? It is a little bit. It feels almost like a little bit provocative in that way, and in a way that feels true to me. And I wonder if you could speak to that.
Sure, a little bit. I can try. So the first thing I had to do in sort of putting together the syllabus was to kind of deal with this discomfort I had about, or skepticism I had about the idea that there is a Black experience. I tried to ask myself, well, what is a Black experience? So my first answer is there isn't just one. I want to say we're diverse people. Black people are not a monolith. We've got lots of difference. And I was really reluctant and resistant to kind of go in that. But I said, well, if there is something that we all have in common, what is that? And that led me right to certainly in the United States, it led me to history. It led me to the fact that we're all kind of in the shadow of the enslavement. We're all in the shadow of like relentless, certain historical events. The Civil War, the aftermath of that, the Jim Crow era. I could talk about those things in some length. I should say, in preparing the class, it was very clear in my mind that my class was going to debut in January 2009, which was the moment that the U.S. had elected its first Black president. And there was, a lot of conversation about maybe America was finally getting to be post-racial. And I think every Black person had to kind of process that, whether regardless of how strongly identified you were as a Black person. It was a global phenomenon, at the time the class was getting launched. And so I think you'd have to be under a rock to not, be thinking about this. So for me, I started to notice, there are some things that are kind of common. No matter where you are, you have to kind of process this in some way. And so that was sort of one of the ideas that the history and the kind of the current events of the world, especially as they pertain to Blackness, is going to be a major driver of this course. Another thing that became clear to me, was that I had taught many courses on cultural diversity and ethnic issues and stuff, but it occurred to me that once I allowed myself to focus specifically on Black people, so not just people of color, then racism as a driver of behavior, what became such a much more important and central topic that I had to contend with. So, as a psychologist, I ask myself, what is the province of psychology? We're interested as psychologists in the study of, why we think what we think, why we feel what we feel, why we do what we do. And I would say for me, it's like, okay, I want to understand research that speaks to why Black people think what they think, do what they do, feel what they feel. And racism sort of is one of those major contributors. And it's a topic that is not to be found in an intro psychology textbook as its own separate chapter. It might appear in social psychology as a footnote, essentially, under the broader topic of discrimination and intergroup relations. But racism looms large in black consciousness, not for every Black person, but for many Black people, and is a very big part of all sorts of things. And I think that this class, it was clear to me, okay, if we're going to do a class about the psychology of the Black experience, there's going to be a lot of discussion of racism, and then that, in a sense, led me back to even a discussion about race, which is itself a contentious and complicated topic, but again, is so linked to racism. So those were some things that grew into this. And coming back to your point about that the title implies that certain things are done from the white perspective. Yeah, so one of the things I wanted to challenge myself to do was to say, take topics that are covered in other psychology courses, but bring a Black lens to them. And I just to pick one would be let's just pick the one of language acquisition. At Smith College, we've had a long tradition, and we have a lot of faculty who are interested in language acquisition, and we've done a lot of important work in how babies acquire language and all of this stuff. So I took that topic, but also leaned into like African American vernacular English, essentially, sometimes called Ebonics. So, which again is something that would not likely be covered in another course that's talking about language acquisition. But here we wanted to take up this issue of Black speech and where it comes from, and you can apply principles of language acquisition, kind of how languages are acquired, linguistics, to Black speech, looking at what happened with Creolized languages during the enslavement period. You can find traces of things that show up in Black speech that I think are really quite remarkable because, to the layperson, particularly the white layperson, Black speech is often taken as deficient speech, a sign of some low education or something's wrong with this person. Why can't they learn to speak English in the proper way? But what you end up seeing is that it really has much more in common with a dialect, and that it is also a powerful container for culture. And so one of the reasons why Black people sort of speak the way that they do is not, it has to do with that this is an intentional way to kind of retain culture. And that part is sometimes missed, and so anyway, those are the kinds of things. So the class gets us into places that you would never otherwise get to without having that.
And I mean, I think you're describing this work, which actually seems very complicated to me in pulling together this particular class compared to maybe other classes that you teach, which have their own challenges, I'm sure. But you're talking about linguistics and sociology and history and psychology and many different ways of getting into the field of psychology to describe this thing that is a little bit nebulous. Does it exist even, you've said, of Black psychology? Maybe do you have like a working definition of that? What do we even mean by Black psychology in this sense?
Sure. One of the interesting sort of subplots of the course is that there are at least two Black psychologies that we try to teach about on a parallel track. And one I've been speaking about a lot now, so I'll just name that one first, which is what is sometimes referred to as the so-called pro-Black psychology. This is a psychology that developed in response to what some have referred to as scientific racism. So we have a period in our history of social science where anthropologists and others were doing studies that basically were interpreted as reinforcing the inferiority of Black people. So you have, anthropologists and eugenicists and other folks who are looking at skull sizes and IQ and a variety of other things that keep showing the ways in which Black people are less than white people. And lots of young Black scholars had a reaction to that and felt that this was basically just reinforcing and putting a stamp on pre-existing cultural stereotypes. And it really called for a need for Black scholars to do their own psychology. There's sort of a famous story I tell in my class where a group of Black psychologists went to the American Psychological Association meeting in San Francisco in the late 1960s and demanded certain rights within APA, and then decided to secede from APA and form their own association of Black psychologists. So one strand of psychology, of Black psychology, is a reaction to racism, essentially, in the U.S. and trying to kind of develop a psychology that is written from the perspective of Black folks in the U.S. But then another important strand sort of says that there was a psychology of Black folks that pre-existed enslavement. And this one probably has more in common with what a student would be taught in an Africana Studies department, because it really then goes back to West Africa, looks at West African religion and language and cultural tradition, and asks basically, what ties, because, Africa's a huge place, all sorts of different countries. And so again, the same dilemma I described at the beginning, like, is there some sort of common psychology that ties together all of these countries on the African continent? And of course, it's not a perfect fit, but there are some commonalities and ways to contrast the way spirituality works in West African countries, the way the notions of collectivism, notions of the self, actually. So, the boundaries of the self. I mean, one of the big distinctions often made in cross-cultural psychology has to do with a highly individualized self that is promoted in the West, where you are just your physical body, versus a self that's more collective, that's connected to others. And people often, others might be familiar with the sort of Eastern or Asian kind of version of this, where there's a emphasis on collective that has to do with the family often. You're very concerned with what your parents think and your multi-generational groups think. I would say in Black psychology, there's something really similar to that, going back to West Africa, but I would say there's also kind of a collective, more like a tribe kind of thing as well. So it's not just the family, but it's sort of the race. It's sort of the people as a collective kind of self.
Mm-hmm. So embedded in the idea of the psychology of Black experiences is an idea about race itself. And when we talk about race, there's also the specter of racism and the way that plays out in this psychology of Black experience. Can you help us understand what these categories are, what they mean, and how they affect this experience?
So what I'll say about that is, I start off with, trying to define what race is, and then basically, saying to the students early on, and that the idea of race is contested. So on the one hand, we see it with our eyes, we put people in racial categories, but they learn that race is more malleable than you might think, and that it's been defined, through law to be different things, even within the U.S. We get into things about the so-called one-drop rule, where somebody who could look very white if they have one drop of African-American ancestry by law, are defined as Black. And so they start to see the nuances of how we define race. And it takes us to a place where we might feel tempted to abandon the whole idea of race. I mean, the idea of race is pretty divisive in a way, and it can be argued that it's more socially constructed than backed up by genetics. Many biologists would say that we have more in common genetically than we do differ even across racial lines. Mm-hmm. But one of the things I've, over the many years, been trying to do with my class is to unpack the word racism and to give my students a sense that it is a broad concept that we probably as a society would be better off if we always tacked on some other word to the word racism, so we could be really clear what we mean by it. So I talk to the students about a spectrum of racism. On the one end, there are these intra-psychic forms of racism. And one example of that would be to hold a stereotypical view of people of different racial persuasions. And if you hold that view and it sits in your mind and you never act on it, that to me is something that virtually 100% of us have that form of racism. And then we can have another, as we go away from the intrapsychic, we move into the interpersonal, where then we might choose to act on that in some way. And the way we act on it might be unconscious or conscious, again, if it's either way, it could be harmful to the person when they receive it. And we talk about, microaggressions, things that again might be intended to be positive, like someone asking you, "Oh, where are you from?" Or, "Hey, you speak." Someone might say to me, "Hey, you speak in a very articulate way." And again, my take on that: this person probably means no harm by that at all. But to the person receiving it, is what they might take great offense. And so part of it is trying to understand what that comes from and why that happens. But then we get into the more overt, where people know exactly what they're saying and what they're doing, and they're dropping the N-word, and they are intentionally want to hurt you. There's that. And then it goes further into systems where there are rules and regulations set up that have the effect of disproportionately affecting Black folks. They learn about, for example, crack cocaine legislation versus powder cocaine legislation. They learn about criminal justice disparities, other ones. Things with housing and employment, and we go through all the ways in which racism can manifest at a systemic level, at a policy level. And then we go all the way to the other end of the spectrum, which is things like ethnic cleansing. And so they get a whole spectrum of racism, and they see that all of these things can be rooted in a kind of what some might call a racist ideology. But in my class, I do try to say that it's very important that we always maintain an appreciation for the fact that the holding the mental stereotype is not the same level of social injustice and crime as genocide. And one of the struggles we sometimes have in our society is that we might react to a microaggression. Like I might react to somebody saying I'm articulate as if they've called me the N-word. And I think we got to be careful about that. And I think it's one of the things I try to do in my class is to help students to explore. I mean, I might feel like you've called me the N-word when you tell me that I'm articulate. But my Black students, I try to invite them to reflect on that, and to maybe not insist that the other person definitely means that the N-word, just because, yes, they might be referring to a stereotype in their minds that Black people should talk a certain way and you don't talk that way, and so they're I get that, but I think we do some harm in our society when we drop that R word, the racist word, on all of these things, because I think we can unpack them and see they come from different directions. And I think my class is a great laboratory for students to begin to explore, like why those feelings come up, what they mean, and sometimes to then think about different ways to respond to these kinds of situations, so we can focus our attention on the more, I think, egregious forms of racism, where people really do mean what they say, or the policies that do severe harm. I think those are the places where we want to spend most of our energy, and less on the unintentional, slights that do happen, and I think, to me, are the costs of doing business in a diverse world. I think in a diverse world, there's going to be the paper cuts and the oops and the outs, and those are coming from unintentional places, and it's important we give people the room to some grace, to be able to learn from those things, to apologize for making mistakes like that, and to try to move on if we can. And then work together against the more serious, I think, and damaging forms of racism. So that's kind of how we work with it in my class.
That's very interesting. I had as you know, the great opportunity when the COVID pandemic hit, that your class moved to a Zoom format for a couple of years, and you graciously let me audit the class, and I tried to stay way in the background and not interfere with things, but. I left it with such a great appreciation of the way that you taught it. I mean, just even pedagogically, so that and now hearing you describe this, I think I have more of a cognitive understanding of why I was having that really very emotional reaction about it. And it's that I think you're, and tell me if this is right or if it fits at all, I don't know, but that you're modeling something very sophisticated, I think, very complicated, I mean to say, for two very different audiences at the same moment.
I'm trying to, for me, I'm so concerned with how much trouble we have sort of getting along in our society across all of our lines of difference. I was born in 1969 in Brooklyn, New York, and I feel like I was conscious of the civil rights movement from the time I was born, probably made conscious by my parents, and understood that I was inheriting a world that people had died to open certain doors of privilege to me and people looking like me. And I've been so lucky to have been in, to be a trailblazer in certain ways. And so it's heartbreaking for me, to see some of those potentials fall apart. And so what you're describing for me is I see myself in the position to try to hold the glue together. And it is complicated because, when I was a younger person, I sort of was sold the melting pot idea and a bit of the color blindness idea. We're all going to just see each other as people. We're just going to melt in, and let's put race and racism behind us. There'd been too much, pain and suffering in the 60s. Let's just not talk about it anymore. And I bought that for a while, but then I started to hear the critiques about that. And particularly, again, from marginalized people saying, hey, when you homogenize, when you say, let's all melt in, the melting pot comes out kind of white, like it kind of erases, it sort of forces everybody else to mix into the majority. So we're looking for a more pluralistic society where we can still be ourselves, or we can sort of bring our cultural values forward, where we can still be seen for who we are. We don't want to have to talk the way you talk, dress the way you dress, or whatever, to be here. So that to me is very valid. I think when diversity is at its best, I'll give a very trivial example here. Hopefully I don't undermine everything I'm saying, but one thing I hope everybody can relate to is, where you find yourself falling in love with something that comes from another culture. And it could be something like a food that you like, and that you like, once a month, you always have to have whatever the food is, Asian food of some kind. And think about what that adds to you, that flavor, the pleasure you have from it. Or maybe it's a form of art or something you really love. I think that's the experience. Is I think for the Black students, is a place for them to sort of build esteem and pride and understand and all that stuff. And then for the witnesses who are not part of the culture, to gain an appreciation, to sort of see that I can take from this something for me too. And aren't I lucky to live in a society where I get access to these ideas, this tradition? I mean, some of it, there's lessons about resilience. There's all sorts of things. I'll just say, just to turn it on myself for a minute, I'm a man who works at a women's institution. And I try to check my male privilege. I try to, the leaders at my school, the president's a woman, the provost is a woman. Most of my colleagues are women. And so as a man, I'm always working on, being in a space that is set up for women. There are not many spaces like this, and to kind of see, how my privileges, it forces me to see that, and that's what I ask my white students to do. Essentially, they're in a predominantly white space, but how can they see what's going on with the Black students, and also step to the side a little bit, and then see the benefit? So that's kind of what I'm trying to accomplish.
Yeah. So, Professor Pole, in addition to teaching this undergraduate class, I know you also teach in the School for Social Work, where I also have been able to teach for actually about the same amount of time as this course has existed, for about 15 years. And when I reflect on that time myself and my teaching, it sometimes it can feel almost like different worlds. So much has changed in the world at large, in the way that we talk about and think about things, and in some ways that have felt to me very hard, in some ways that have felt like a real expansion of our consciousness into some really helpful directions. I wonder if you can talk a bit about the way that this course has changed and evolved over this period of time.
Yeah. I'm continually surprised by how fresh the class is. It hasn't been a kind of repeating the same thing over and over again. The framework I'm describing, is essentially what the class is. I teach roughly the same topics, but it seems to me like every year I teach it, there's something in the world that gives the class powerful resonance. And I'll just give a few examples. I told you the very first time I taught it, it was, the inauguration of Barack Obama happened in the same month of the first time I taught this class. And the class used to be taught in the spring semester, which means January to May. And so Black History Month would always happen when I taught the course. And then I started shifting it to the fall. So then the class often coincides with political elections. And race almost always gets stirred up around political elections. And so you can imagine in this last election at a women's college, with one of the candidates being a Black South Asian woman, that definitely influenced how the class went. I found myself leaning much, much more into what we call intersectionality, this last time, that we had much more deep and rich discussions about divisions between Black men and Black women than we would have had at some other time. So the class was able to, and I think that was for the better, because what it does is it takes apart the so-called Black experience to, there's some sub-experiences. There's experiences with Black queer people. There's experience with Black men, Black women, and we actually did a whole thing on Black conservatives. And all of that was speaking to the moment and things that I hadn't really leaned on in previous years. So I would say, yes, I keep doing this, but I'm doing this in a way that's fresh and I think a new and stimulating to me. And I think always strikes the students as like giving them something to help them understand the world they're currently living in. And if I'm doing my job well, we're able to predict at least a little bit into the future about where we're going. So I hope that the class has that. But when I think about the part that is psychology, I gave a definition about, the study of behavior and all this. But I think that what psychologists wish that they can do, psychologists have what I often call physics envy. We want to have laws of human behavior.
Yes, yeah.
And so for me, the sweet spot is if my class really can tell a story that does predict the future, that I don't want to simply be reporting on current events. I don't want the class to just be about the present and reactive. I really wanted to equip students with a sense of what are the driving forces in human behavior that help us to understand, what's happening now, what's going to happen next. What are those things? I think that's the ambition, is that we're telling relatively timeless stories about what drives human behavior. That's kind of what psychologists want to do, separate from maybe other disciplines that might be doing either telling the past in some particular way or maybe analyzing the current times.
That's wonderful. And I'd like to ask, reflecting back on, the way that initial trepidation about the class that you had, and now 15 years of really teaching it, making it your own, changes in the world that have happened, many experiences with students being affected by that in both audiences and groups. How do you think that doing this has changed you?
Oh, great question. Yeah, because I no longer feel any skepticism about the value of a class like this. I will say what's been interesting from the seat that I'm in is to say I did not come up with the title of this. This was not my choice. Mm-hmm. But I feel like the world every year convinces me that this topic is relevant. January 2009, I'm about to step out in front of these students and teach a class called Psychology of the Black Experience that was full of references to the civil rights movement and to racism. And in the newspapers was, not only Obama has been inaugurated, but that we were now post-racial. And all of that stuff was in the rearview mirror. So, the counter view was that this class is outmoded, irrelevant. We're all beyond this now. Everything you're going to talk about is old 1960s mentality, nothing to do with, the world we're about to enter because we've got Obama as president. And I was quickly disabused of that. Again, I was open to that possibility. I mean, the class was going forward, but I was ready to scrap it if suddenly we were post-racial and didn't need this class. But the opposite happened, and we seem to need it. From the first, just to remind you and the listeners, within a few weeks, there was an incident where Harvard president, Henry Louis Gates is, stopped at his house in Massachusetts because entering his own home and has a confrontation with a white police officer, and Obama has to bring them both to the White House to have a conversation about race.
The beer summit, yeah.
Yeah, and it goes on and on from that. Then we get all these killings of unarmed Black men. And every year that I'm teaching this class, there is some new racial struggle that's happening in the country. So I would like my class to be obsolete. I would like it if the world didn't demand this class. I think I'm changed in the sense that I now see that I've now fully embraced this as part of my professional portfolio. Let's put it that way. And I think that's something, because I did not come to this class as somebody who was primarily focused on race, culture, and ethnicity. It was something I did as a secondary thing, and it's become more of a primary thing. And I think it's because it feels to me like very worthy work that the world and the country needs and seems to need increasingly, And I would say also needs it from somebody who's willing to try to be compassionate with those who are skeptical about this. I still want to maintain a way to bring people in who who have trepidations like I did at the beginning, and maybe worse than what I did at the beginning, more hostile than I was. But I can see why somebody is not fully bought in, and I still can see that, and I would like to find ways to bring people to the table, because I think the only way forward, we can't, Black people are about 12 to 15% of the population, depending on how you look at it, of the U.S. Our survival depends on having allies that are not Black, who see a sense of common cause and who want to sit down to the table for us so we can all figure out how to live in this world together in a way that is mutually satisfying. So for me, that's another reason why a class like this is needed, is to kind of bring more people to the table.
Well, and thank you so much for talking with me today about this, Professor Pole.
Yeah, you are totally welcome. Thank you very much, Kurt.
Absolutely. Thank you again to Professor Pole for that very stimulating conversation, and joining me again here is Mary Wilson, who's been listening along. Hi, Mary.
Hello. That was such an interesting conversation between you and Professor Pole. You touched on so much, but I'm sure it just scratched the surface of what the class that he teaches is really all about.
It was. I learned so much in doing that, and also even today, and sort of getting underneath the thinking behind the creation of this. I think sort of to look at the building blocks of it and the sort of intentions of a course like this. I think it informs so much about how we might, challenge ourselves to look at the world through different kinds of prisms of experience. I don't know. What about you? What did you make of all this?
Yeah, it was so interesting to hear about an experience, of course, so different from mine, and also the historical context that goes into it. It was really great to just try to envision things through a different perspective.
Yeah. Perhaps for people who are finding themselves wishing that they could take the class, he's given us some resources, hasn't he?
Yeah, after hearing that conversation, it would be so great to take that class. But yeah, Professor Pole has provided a bunch of resources from the syllabus of the Psychology, the Black Experience, including the textbook, which is called African American Psychology from Africa to America, several further readings, and also a good variety of selected videos. And we'll put the links to all of those in our show notes.
I hope people will check those out. I think there's some really wonderful stuff in there.
Absolutely.
Unravelling is brought to you by Brattleboro Retreat. Our producers at Charts and Leisure are Andrew Atkin, Hans Butow, and Jason Oberholzer.
And you can find us on social media by searching Brattleboro Retreat. Brattleboro Retreat is committed to exploring diverse perspectives on mental health. While we invite hosts and guests to share their insights, the views expressed are their own and do not necessarily reflect the policies or positions of the hospital or its staff.